When you have a show about gratitude, you've got to be grateful for your sponsors. And in our life of gratitude, we all have guides. Somebody that guided us through our lives, that made us appreciate those things that we have. And that's why I'm so delighted and so grateful for our sponsor, Life Guides. Life Guides is a peer-to-peer community that helps people navigate through their day-to-day stressors by providing a place of empathy, listening, wisdom, and support with a guide who has walked in your shoes, experiencing the same challenge or life experience as you. A true life guide. And because you're listening to our gratitude podcast, if you go to their website, lifeguides.com/schedule a demo and add the code HEALTHY2021. The code is HEALTHY2021 in the free text box. You'll get 2 months of their services for free. 2 months for free. So sign up, show your team you care, get a life guide, be grateful for those guides in your life, as I am grateful for our sponsor, Life Guides. Hey everybody, welcome to Leading with Gratitude Live. I'm your host, Chester Elton, the apostle of appreciation, coming to you live and in color from the gratitude epicenter of the universe, Summit, New Jersey. We always say, give us 30 minutes and we'll give you 30 minutes of great information, great inspiration, and a roadmap to a life of gratitude at work and in your personal life. And we're broadcasting on LinkedIn Live, Facebook, YouTube, and we couldn't be more grateful that you're giving us a little bit of your time today to talk about gratitude. And of course, this is all brought to you on the wonderful Methods Network. If you're looking to do some great online production, there's only one place to go. His name is Brent Klein. Brent at methodsofleaders.com, 512-639-2120. Take a screenshot so you don't forget it. Well, listen, I'm excited to introduce to you my new friend. She's an amazing business person. She's an amazing pilot. She's had an incredible life, and she's written an incredible book. I'm excited to introduce to you my new friend, Shannon Huffman Polson. Let me tell you a little bit about her amazing story. Shannon is the founder of the G.R.I.T Institute and one of the first women to fly Apache helicopters for the U.S. Army as a captain and a pilot. Shannon earned her MBA at Dartmouth and worked in the corporate jungle for several years, including a stint at Microsoft, before writing some successful books, including The Grit Factor that came out last year with Harvard Business Review Press. Her organization, the G.R.I.T Institute, trains leaders in skills that are critical for individual and team success, focusing on courage, compassion, and commitment with an emphasis on grit and leadership in times of challenge and change. We are grateful for her service and for her time today. Welcome to the show, Shannon. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks so much, Chester. It's a real honor to be here with you today.
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank you for your service, for protecting the country and giving us all our great liberties that we have. So thank you so much for that. Before we jump in, I want to ask, so what compelled you to sign up to join the military, and why helicopters?
That's always the $1,000,000 question. I had gone from a home in Alaska back to college in North Carolina at Duke University. And back in the 90s, that was a very long way to go. Actually, it was the late 80s, I guess. And I was looking for ways to help pay for college, to be frank. And so I stopped by at a college fair at the Army ROTC counter. And I didn't think I would like it, but I thought I'd give it a try. And at least I could say that I'd tried it. And I ended up really connecting to this concept of service and purpose, of something bigger than myself. And that was really the beginning of what would take the rest of my 20s. It would be a decade of service in uniform, and truly an honor to serve. The helicopter piece was knowing that I had service that was required to pay off my scholarship. I was really looking for the most adventurous way to do that. So I figured if I had a commitment, I wanted to serve in a way that was the most challenging, the most difficult, the most interesting, and I think I found it.
Yeah, no kidding. I've been to a couple of air shows, and one had an Apache helicopter. And if you've never seen an Apache helicopter like flying low, let me tell you something, that thing will scare the crap out of you. That is one intimidating machine.
They're pretty amazing. Yeah, I was again grateful for the chance to fly those, and I will always miss that time in the air for sure with those incredible aircraft.
Well, the show is called Leading with Gratitude. And of course, we always like to start and end on gratitude. I'm sure during your journey, there were people that you were grateful for that came into your career early and then in your business life. So, when I say that, who are a couple of people that come to mind that you're particularly grateful for that have helped you along the way?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you start with this question, Chester, because one of the pieces that came out in the grit factor was the importance of building your team and understanding that none of us do this alone. It feels very lonely sometimes in either leadership positions or positions where you're breaking into a new field, but nobody does it alone. And I would actually start with somebody who worked for me. And as a young lieutenant, I had a platoon sergeant named Sergeant Couturier. We called him C for short. And he was an exceptional leader of the soldiers, really the mechanics that took care of the aircraft. And I simply couldn't have done my job without him. But beyond just doing the job, he really helped me to learn and grow into that position. And it was an absolutely critical thing. I think one of the things that I talk to companies and organizations around the world about is that we learn and grow from people who we work for, but also the people that work for us. And we both have the responsibility to take care of them, but also to learn from them. On the flip side of that, my battalion commander as a young lieutenant also was exceptional and really worked to develop junior officers. And again, taking care of your people being the primary piece of this and understanding that we work together as a team. I mean, we knew that every time we took off, we only had 2 pilots in that aircraft, but it took a team to launch that. And every time we took off from the ground, I put my life in the hands of the guys that turned the wrenches and checked the logbooks. So that team component was so critical. And I'm incredibly grateful for both the opportunity to learn from the platoon sergeant, but also from that battalion commander, both of whom were utterly dedicated to developing and bringing out the best in all of the young new leaders.
It's so interesting. I have such admiration for the military because it really is a team effort in everything you do, isn't it? I mean, you've got to depend on the mechanics, the leadership, the guys that are giving you the directions and so on. Now, flying an Apache helicopter, you know, that's still very much a male dominated, culture, right? I mean, there's no mystery there, and a lot of testosterone and a lot of bravado and a lot of ego. As a woman
Absolutely.
breaking in, yeah, as a woman breaking into that, what were some of the lessons you learned on how to navigate through that, and some advice you might give other women that are headed into cultures like that? Maybe not the military, maybe it's male dominated banking or tech. Any
Yes.
advice there?
Yeah, and those are some of the audiences that I speak to regularly. A couple of the things that I think are really quite universal in any of these experiences, and honestly, whoever you are, but especially as a minority in a majority field, is the opportunity to come in and really focus on outstanding work. And if you do excellent work, it makes it very, very difficult for anybody to have anything negative to say. The second part of it, and this is hard because the studies are pretty clear that women are penalized for doing exactly this, but is looking for those stretch assignments, taking on those stretch assignments, taking risks in your career, which every leader understands is part of the path to success, both taking those risks and being willing to face fear and willing to face failure. But that's harder for women to do sometimes, or any minority in a majority field, because when they do fail, and we all fail along the way, they suffer greater penalties. But it's still really important to just get your head down, focus on the work, do exceptional work, and then take on those stretch assignments. Really look for those opportunities to learn and grow into a role. But finally, I would say when you face a group of naysayers, if there is a group of naysayers, really there's a piece of the work that is about kind of putting those blinders on, sort of like those workhorses you see, and staying just utterly focused on what that goal is. And again, with exceptional performance, there's very, very little that anybody can say. And all the good folks will be appreciative of it.
Yeah, it's great advice. It's great advice. The grit factor, for those of you, it's in the back there, but I'm telling you, this is a riveting read. It's an easy read. It's a fun read. Uh, I'd find bookstores everywhere, I'm sure. And where would you send people to learn more about your work, Shannon? I think it's shannonhuffmanpolson.com, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, very close. ShannonPolson.com and also thegritinstitute.com, because a lot of these learnings that are in the grit factor, and it's been my privilege to have the opportunity to interview dozens of leaders in the vanguards of their fields that really forms the spine of what makes up the stories and the lessons learned in the Grit Factor. And that comes out and is expanded on in training at the Grit Institute that's available both to individuals as well as to larger organizations. So shannonpolson.com and thegritinstitute.com are great both places.
Excellent. And follow her on LinkedIn as well. Hey, I love the title, The Grit Factor. And, before we went live, we were talking about, give me your definition of grit, because, and why is that so important? Not just in your military career, but just in life in general. So give me a definition of grit and why it's so important.
Great. Yeah. And then Harvard Business Review Press, which published the Grit Factor, gets all the credit for picking that particular name. And I'm really grateful that they did. But I have defined grit. And now many of you, I'll back up into what many of you may have heard, which is Angela Duckworth's incredible work from University of Pennsylvania, which looks at passion and perseverance towards a very long-term goal. And I have defined grit as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances, because sometimes those goals are hard to see, especially in the last year and a half or so, right? It's been a very, very unclear horizon. Sometimes that passion isn't always there. And so that perseverance, that dogged determination is really critical. And in a society where many things are considered to be disposable, it's a very sort of a fickle perspective on relationships and how it is that we engage. It's particularly important to understand that in order to really leave a legacy, to make a significant contribution wherever it is that you are, it's critical to stay the course, right? To really dig in and understand that things are going to be tough and you've got to stick with it. And while there is a flip side to that, there are, of course, times to leave. And one of the things that really comes out of, again, and I have the chance to talk to organizations around the world regularly, but it's pretty clear that the place where we need the most work is actually in just sticking with the work. And that doesn't mean that you aren't adaptable. I know we're going to talk about that in a moment, but it does mean sticking to the course and having that dogged determination to really make sure that we're going to reach that goal that we have in front of us.
That's great. Dogged determination. I love that. Now, if you've got questions for Shannon, by the way, just put them in the chat box and we'll pull them up for you. We often get a very international audience here, Shannon, so it'll be fun to see what the questions are. So just go ahead and if you've got a question about grit, your career, whatever, see if you can stump the expert here. I mean, she flies Apache helicopters, so she's not going to get intimidated by any of your questions. Trust me on this one.
Not at all.
Let me ask you, a lot of people say, look, grit, like either you've got it or you haven't. In your book, you talk about, look, it's a skill and you can develop that skill. So how do you take somebody that's maybe a little more timid, and that word dogged can be kind of intimidating, right? How do you teach somebody to develop grit?
I love this question so much. And I'm going to back up just a little bit to tell you the genesis of the Grit Factor came about when a young lieutenant asked me to mentor her as she began the same journey that I had taken these many years before, going to flight school, becoming an aviation leader. And I immediately said yes, but then realized it had been a number of years since I'd worn the uniform, a number of years since I had served. And my time integrating into an all-male field was surely somewhat unique. So I wondered how I could scale what I offered to her. And if I did that work, scale the people to whom the findings were offered. And that was the genesis of the Grit Factor, with dozens, again, of interviews with leaders in the vanguards of their fields that happen to be women. They happen to be military. They're general officers across the services, aviators from World War II to the present. And every one of them faced this double crucible of not only the incredible challenges, sometimes in combat, sometimes breaking into new roles, whatever the military will throw at you, which is usually quite significant, but also working in environments which often were not receptive and sometimes openly hostile to their being there. So that double crucible, which is a term coined by a Stanford law professor, was something that really required an extra measure of grit. And in these conversations, what comes out are really what I now call the grit triad. So there's commit, learn, and launch, connected to past, present, and future, looking at grit as a much more integral part of our characters. And that shows us that grit, and the science is pretty clear on this, grit is not something that is just for military pilots and big mountain climbers. Grit is innate to every single one of us. And I talk about finding that at the intersection of your purpose, your core purpose, and your passion. And I help lead people to that core purpose. But it's also about building through daily practices. And one of those, Chester, of course, is gratitude.
I love that you threw gratitude in there. You know your audience, don't you, Shannon?
Had
That's
to do it.
awesome. It's really interesting. So we've got folks tuning in from the UK. By the way, congratulations. England is in the Euro 2020 final in football. South Africa from Illinois. But we've got a question from Jim Stanton. He says, okay, so how do you get more grit? Like you say, everybody's got a little bit, right? And you talk about developing that. So how do you say, I haven't got quite enough grit? How do I get more grit? Great question, Jim.
It is a great question. And I hear that a lot from people who may have felt like they had it in the past also, but maybe they've lost their sense of connection to that.
Oh,
And the biggest way I would say, again, in the book, we talk about some very specific daily practices. But just to get to a more meta level here, it's really about understanding that when we do hard things, we get better at doing hard things. And challenging yourself to push yourself out of your comfort zone in any arena can help to build those muscles that you can pull into those arenas where you don't feel like you quite have access to that grit. So if at work you're facing a big challenge, but you just don't feel like you can push yourself that extra mile, doing that perhaps in, training for a race that makes you run farther than you've ever run, or maybe you're learning a foreign language. And then you realize the strength that you get, the ability you have to push through those challenges. And simply, there's an extension of this from the growth mindset work from Stanford, also Carol Dweck's work, of course, understanding simply the neuroscience that as you challenge yourself to push yourself outside of the places where you're comfortable, you get better at doing hard things. That actually builds that muscle of grit and resilience. And that's one of many practices that you can do, but I think it's a great place to start.
I love that. The more you do hard things, the more hard things you can do. That's great advice. Hey, listen, I want to take just a second and thank our sponsor. We talk about investing in yourself, investing in your grit, becoming a better leader. Well, the folks at methodsofleaders.com have this great online training. They've got Hortense Le Gentil that talks about aligning your life, Sally Helgeson about how women rise, Marshall Goldsmith, the greatest executive coach of all time, shares his secrets, and Martin Lindstrom in marketing. And I even have a course in there on teamwork. So visit www.methodsof.com. And because you're listening to our wonderful live show, if you just put in the code box there, Gratitude 2021 at checkout, you get a 50% discount. Take a screenshot, methodsof.com, Gratitude 2021, get a 50% discount. Invest in yourself, invest in your leadership. You'll never regret that. Well, Shannon, as you were talking about the more hard things you do, the more hard things you can do, I was drawn to the dedication of your book, where right at the front, you said, to the memory of Doggold and Tori McMullen, who gave you a home as a young lieutenant in Fort Bragg. What were some of the lessons that they taught you? I mean, we've written a lot of books, and when you dedicate a book, you give it a lot of thought, and clearly they
Yes.
have a special place in your heart. So tell me why.
Yeah, and they were both wonderful, wonderful people. Dugald had been an infantry battalion commander in Vietnam, and Tori had been part of this military family that had lost people in every engagement in the 20th century. So they had this very strong sense of service, and specifically military service. And I met them actually at the water cooler at church, and they invited me to their home, and repeatedly we'd get together for dinner, and they would check in on how things were going. But the story that I'd love to share is actually not from Dugald, who was that infantry battalion commander, who was a wonderful supporter, but actually from Tori, who's this diminutive, actually musician, a child prodigy, apparently, as a pianist in North Carolina. And now this lovely Southern lady who would give me books to take home. And I couldn't ever quite figure out what it was that she was doing. She gave me a book called West with the Night by Beryl Markham, which I couldn't recommend highly enough to people. I gave it to all of my bridesmaids at my wedding. Also, A Road from Karain by Jill Carr Conway. And what she taught me was how much we can gain strength from the power of story, not just our own stories and where we've overcome hardships, but actually in the stories of other people who have also overcome hardships. And they become really part of this extended team because our brains take in information in the form of story. So when we read these stories of people who have overcome incredible odds, Beryl Markham was one of the early women aviatrices in Africa, actually, flew east to west across the Atlantic, the first person to do so. Jill Carr Conway broke into academia from an Australian sheep farm where this very male-dominated culture didn't support women going further in their careers. And so although they seem to be a little bit on the margins of what I could understand, that actually helped me identify what those strengths that I could take from those stories even more so. And I'm incredibly grateful to both of them and their lives, their service, and what it is that they shared with me during a time when I was still learning and growing.
Isn't that great? They gave you books, and you read those books and it inculcates, as you're talking about Tori and you're talking about, those people you're grateful for, I couldn't help but think of the power of knowing your story. And you talk about that, and not just knowing your story, knowing where you come from. It's really interesting.
Yes.
My wife tells our kids all the time that your ancestors did hard things and you can do hard
Ooh,
things. So knowing,
yeah.
their heritage and their story, you talk a lot about knowing your story, that's really
Yes.
important because then it also allows you to be adaptable. So tie those two things together for me, knowing your story and adaptability.
And Chester, this is one of the absolute best questions because again, in that grit triad, and the book is broken out into commit, learn, and launch, right? The commit phase is the foundation of grit. And that's owning your own story. But it's not just owning it in that you know it. It's saying that here's the raw material of my life, right? These are the things that I've been given, some of which I've asked, some of which I would never want, some of which I feel like I've earned, much of which was grace. And our opportunity and our responsibility is to take that raw material and to shape it into the life where we can best contribute. And it's an incredible opportunity. And in that first chapter of the Grit Factor, we talk about in this commit phase, in this foundational phase of owning our past, the very first piece is owning our story. And I'll give exercises at the end of each chapter. As you know, we go from story into the background research, which is the most current research and leadership and grit and psychology. And then we go into the tactical ways to apply that in your own life. And so I have an exercise that I suggest that I've worked through with many, many corporate clients as well in larger groups, which is incredibly powerful, which is a lifeline exercise. But we go over the lifeline not once, but 4 times, really pulling out those places where we had inflection points, where we maybe fell or had a difficult experience, or we had a positive experience, what we learned, what values come out of that, and then how we can really focus on those values. And the way that connects to adaptability is once we set the foundation for grit, which is owning our story, drilling down to core purpose and heart purpose, that becomes the foundation that you connect to again and again. You've got to do that reconnection again and again. And then you're able to maneuver through whatever turbulence might come your way. It's that groundedness that allows you to adapt and to find new courses to reach that goal.
So great. It's so interesting. I do a lot of coaching, as I know you do as well. And I said, look, there's power in just showing up. Know who you
Yes.
are, and that commit part. Just show up. Like nothing. If you don't show up, nothing can happen. If you show up, at least something is going to happen. So, Adrian Gostick is my co-author. We've been writing together for 20 years now. We just published a book called Anxiety at Work. I've got to believe that in the work that you did, there was a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. How did you deal with that? Give us a couple tips on that as we start to wrap up. I knew our time would fly by, but I wanted to get that question in about how do you deal with anxiety as a pilot in the military, a woman in a man's world, and on and on.
Right. Well, and I'll make it a quick answer. And, we get into more of these tactics and techniques in the book for sure. One is having your team and relying on people that you can trust and care about you and that you care about. One of them is in the midst of the action. So while you're in the cockpit, you've got to do something that we call compartmentalization in aviation, which is to kind of put whatever those anxious fears are in a box and set it aside. And you can come back to that and you'll need to come back to it, but you have to set it aside while you stay focused on the work. But the most important thing, and I've been talking a lot to people about this over the last 12 to 15 months, is just like you go back to basics with owning your own story and drilling down to core purpose, we've got to make time to actually put on your calendar as a professional obligation going back to the basics of making sure that you have enough exercise, that you're sleeping, that you're drinking water, that you're eating your vegetables. Literally, quite frankly, it's taking that time to take care of yourself so that you're able to show up with your best self. And consider that a professional obligation, because when we take care of ourselves, that's how we can manage some of that anxiety that is absolutely a part of any kind of a challenging job, and certainly when the horizon is as uncertain as it continues to be.
You know, it was so interesting that you say that. We had a quote from a doctor said, look, you can't be physically healthy if you're not mentally healthy. And I think the reverse is also true. If you don't take care of yourself physically, mentally, you deteriorate pretty quickly. So the two really are connected. You know, make sure you get your sleep. I love that. You know, the stuff that your mom taught you when you were from, eat your vegetables, you know, eat well. Well, tell us again where people can find out more about you and your wonderful book, and where they can make more connections with the amazing Shannon Polson.
Well, Chester, thank you for this wonderful conversation. You can find me at shannonpolson.com, at thegritinstitute.com, on LinkedIn, and a little bit on Twitter and Instagram. And you can pick up The Grit Factor anywhere that books are sold.
So let me ask you something. As we've been talking and your mind's been racing, and we've got wonderful people tuning in from Argentina and Illinois and St. Louis and Nigeria. If there's one thing you'd want people to remember about grit and the grit factor, what would that be?
One thing, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but is just to remind yourself that it's not something that is just for military pilots, right? I get to tell these stories that are exciting and interesting and come at something from a different angle than most people have the opportunity to experience. And that's a wonderful thing to do. But that's not unique to military pilots. It's absolutely something that belongs to every single one of us. And you can own it, and you can build it with very small, consistent daily practices. So I do hope that you'll check out the Grit Factor. You'll get a sense more of what those daily practices look like, and how it is that you can look at grit as part of the fabric of our character, and know that it's part of your life and your opportunity as well.
Just really well said. Well, the book is The Grit Factor. It's a great read. You know, anybody can buy one, buy two. You know, buy one is for yourself and one for a gift, or the other for a friend. Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the Most Male-Dominated Organization in the World. It's Harvard Business Review Press. Well, listen, we're going to take a time to stick around afterwards, because we want to do a debrief. I know you're in the military. You know what that's all about. But I want to give a little shout out again to our good friends at Methods. You know, if you want to produce a great show online, I'm telling you, Brent Klein out of Austin, Texas, he's the guy. Take a screenshot here. You can reach him at 512-639-2120 or Brent at methodsofleaders.com. And again, invest in yourself. And on the online leadership courses, I'm telling you, they're fabulous. Marshall Goldsmith's there. I'm there. And when you check out, put Gratitude 2021 in the box, you get a 50% discount. Well, you know, our show is based on our Wall Street Journal best-selling award-winning book, Leading with Gratitude. And our good friends at Harper Business produced this great commercial for us. Alan Mullally, the guy that saved the Ford Motor Company, said, I love, love, love this book, with a subtle call to action. Buy me, buy me, buy me. Well, listen, it's been great to have you on the show, Shannon. We sure appreciate everybody that tuned in. You know, give us 30 minutes. We'll give you great information, inspiration, and a roadmap to gratitude. We sure appreciate your time. You're fast making us the #1 LinkedIn live show on gratitude, and we couldn't be more grateful for that. Well, Shannon, we got a tradition here, and it's a lot of fun. We don't just say goodbye. We dance it out, and we bring in our producer, Brent Klein from Austin, Texas. Turn up the music, Brent. We're going to dance it out. That old white man thing that I do. Hey, have a great week. Have a great weekend. Be kind. Be grateful. Be of service. We'll see you back here next week. Shannon, thank you for your service and all you do. Never forget the Grit Factor. Gotta have it.